Really excited today to be talking with Dr. Sally Satel. She is a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a practicing psychiatrist to focus on addiction, and a lecturer at Yale Medical School. And I wanted to talk to you today about the addiction crisis. That's something that I've been circling around with and some of the reporting that I've done on homelessness. There's obviously a high correlation, but addiction is a much bigger problem. And Sally had a great piece in National Affairs magazine called Taking on the Scourge of Opioids, which I thought was one of the best, most succinct, and most realistic analyses of what's going on and how we might be able to fix it. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this kind of new scourge of the opioid addiction and give us a sense of the size and the scope and the impact it's having?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for having me. Yes, as a colleague of mine, Nick Eberstadt, said, it's a new plague for a new century, and it's the worst drug crisis there's been in terms of deaths, overdose deaths. And in fact, the latest data show that you're more, unfortunately, tragically, the rates of dying from an overdose are higher than car crashes. So it's quite considerable. I think 300,000 people have died so far, and it's in some places there is some tapering off, and in other places there's more of a phenomenon where the overdose deaths are declining, and that's great news, of course. But the drug use is not really declining, and that's because of the use of naloxone. So we're saving lives, but not necessarily treating successfully enough lives. And in certain parts of the country, mainly rural parts, Appalachia, northeast of the country, this was kind of kicked off in the late 90s with opioid prescribing, especially of a particularly potent analgesic called OxyContin, which contains oxycodone. That's its active ingredient. That's its active opioid. That's been around for decades. But this was a particularly high dose preparation because it was long acting. So you can imagine if it's supposed to last 12 hours as opposed to 4 to 3 hours, it should have a lot of opioid in it, and it would be slowly released. Well, it didn't take long for people to realize if you crush this, it releases a big bolus, and it's highly addictive. And people rarely use one opioid anyway. They mix them. And when you mix an opioid, which is already a depressant, certainly a respiratory depressant, with alcohol or benzodiazepines, Valium type drugs, it's really lethal. And then fentanyl came along. But in the rural areas, I would say that OxyContin did seed the problem. And then in urban areas, I'd say it's not an epidemic. There, I'd say it's endemic. Lots of drug use. But when fentanyl came in, again, that's so powerful. It's 100 times more powerful than morphine, 50 times more powerful than heroin. And unless you've built up quite a tolerance, it can be deadly. And you never know what you're getting, of course. So fentanyl especially has really raised the stakes on harm reduction, which we can get to in a minute. But I feel I should say something about opioid prescribing, which is definitely going down. Doctors are paying a lot of attention to that. The places in which it took hold first, I mentioned Appalachia and Northeast. These are places with prescribing tradition of where doctors would write for opioids often. And that's because the people who worked there were typically in jobs that were very hard labor jobs. So there was a lot of physical pain. And even though now, especially in Appalachia, a lot of those jobs are not available anymore. But again, this started the tradition. And then also you couldn't refer to a mental health specialist. And a lot of times people would be reluctant to go in some of these places. And you couldn't refer to a pain specialist. So your primary care doc became everything. And ironically, just like in the 1880s, if you look back at our first opioid epidemic, which was with morphine mainly, doctors were using that because that's kind of all they had to manage distress, which was physical distress, mental distress. And in some way, what started in the rural areas was kind of a mirror of that. So that's the background. And when OxyContin started to become less available in 2010 because it was reformulated by the company, making it harder to chop up, that was also a lot of things happened at the same time. The pill mills, which were these really shady, illegal doctors' offices, pain specialists, they basically just wrote you a script for cash. And this was just such a pernicious thing. Then that fueled an underground economy where people would sell those pills. And many of those were closed down by around 2010, especially in Florida, where they were a big problem. But people from all over the country would go to Florida to pick up pills and come back. So those were closed down. OxyContin was reformulated, and doctors were catching on. We have to prescribe less, and then things called PDMPs, um, prescription drug monitoring programs, were online in a much more aggressive way. And all that means is that if I'm your doctor and you come in, Chris, and you look shady to me, or you look like a little strung out, I'm going to see how many other doctors you might have been doctor shopping, and that can be helpful as well. So all those things converged around 2010, 2011, making pills harder to get by people who, only the minority of whom were actual pain patients. A lot of these folks were just people who used drugs. And so when it became harder to get that drug, then there was a migration to heroin. And then a few years later, fentanyl came in. So that kind of gets us up to, I guess, up to the present.
Yeah, and I think one of the points that you make in one of the pieces that I read is the kind of disease model versus the choice model. And people always want to know, well, in essence, whose responsibility is it? Who is to blame, unfortunately? And I've noticed this debate where should it be treated as a disease or a personal choice? And as I read it, it also lines up roughly with left and right. Someone saying essentially society or science or a mechanical human being is responsible, or it's personally responsible, everything is a choice. And what I liked about your piece is that you seem to be somewhere in the messy middle. Can you
Oh, I'm
walk us
definitely
through?
I'm always in the
Yeah.
middle.
And I think that's a hard place to be because it's so much easier to say, well, it's this or it's that. But talk about the balance between these two things
Yeah.
and where you stand.
Well, the mind wants to categorize, and so do politicians. And you're right, there is generally an axis, a left-right axis, in at least how you want to label addiction. I I've stopped I've stopped fighting with people over whether it's a disease or not. And what I do is say, like, for example, if somebody asks me, is addiction a disease? I always ask, what are my choices? Because if it's not a disease, and no, we're forced into this dichotomy, unfortunately, because if you do
Yeah.
question disease, people immediately think you're a Neanderthal who doesn't want to help people with drug problems. You want to lock them up. You don't want to pay for their care. So I always say, those, if those are my choices, what I'm supposed to say, it's a sin or it's a crime in and of itself, say, fine, it's a disease. If those are my choices. But if you want to put a little more thought into it, I think, I'm not you, I know you do. If one wants to put a little more thought into it, then I like to say, if addiction is a disease, then what kind of disease is it? And it is the kind of, I prefer to call it a behavioral condition for what that's worth, but it's the kind of behavioral condition, because you don't call someone an addict unless they behave like one. That's the essence of addiction. It's the behavior. Doesn't mean there aren't brain correlates. Of course there are. And drugs affect the brain. I don't argue that. In fact, it's not even just a disease, according to the National Institute on Drug Abuse. It's a brain disease. I'm not going to argue about the neuroscience and the dopamine. Stipulate, all that's true. The question is, what are the implications of those brain changes? Are they the kind of brain changes you might see in Alzheimer's, where no matter what I said to, let's assume you were at a stage where you weren't really so demented that you couldn't comprehend some things. If I said to you as an Alzheimer's patient, I'm going to give you $1 million if your memory doesn't deteriorate anymore, or I'm going to shoot your dog if it does. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The kinds of brain changes of Alzheimer's are what you would call autonomous. They're going to proceed no matter what your will is. If you tell people with addiction problems, there's going to be this kind of consequence or this sort of reward, there's a good chance that a lot of folks can respond. And we've seen this. There's a huge literature, and I'm happy to, if anybody wants references who listens to this, I'm happy to give them to them. But contingency management just means a manipulation of carrots and sticks to shape behavior. And we see this all over. Everyone who walks into my clinic is there because their wife is going to leave them, their boss is going to fire them, or the parole officer is going to violate them. These are contingencies, and they made a difference. Now, does everybody come into treatment or stop? Some people stop on their own. We don't know about them because they don't come in for help. But does everyone whose wife is going to leave them come into a treatment program? No. But the point is, it shows that the what people like to say, the addicted brain, well, that the brain in its state of addiction is still capable of being influenced by cognition and by consequences. So one of the best examples of that was the Vietnam veteran story from the 1971. There was a lot of drug use in Vietnam, really high quality heroin and opium. And President Nixon, we were talking, a while ago now, but he was very concerned that these GIs would come home and they would further fuel the heroin problems that were already had taken root in the inner cities. So, and the rates of addiction, not just use, but actual addiction, were estimated between 15 and 25%. So that's quite a bit. And a wartime situation, you could almost imagine, especially in Vietnam, was ideal for the use of these drugs because they're all around. So access is great. The purity is amazing. It was normalized because so many people did use drugs, including the heavy marijuana use there. And you're in a war. So what does it mean when you're in a war? It means for many guys and women, it's hours and hours and hours of boredom interspersed by moments of terror. And so the boredom, when you're bored to death, which I think is a big problem for some of the folks, that you've been talking about, a lot of aimless days. And so drugs fill that space. Also, if you're in combat, you may have some degree of post-traumatic, you have some pretty tragic memories to come to grips with. Opioids are good for that. And then that was near the end of the war, and there was a lot of demoralization. So that sort of helped medicate some anger, a lot of real existential anger that folks had. Anyway, the point is, Nixon said, you're not getting on a plane to come back unless you give us a clean urine. You can't leave the country when your time is up, which is usually a year. And it was brilliantly called Operation Golden Flow. You're not leaving Vietnam. You're not going back to your nice apartment in Queens until you give us a clean urine. Well, almost all the guys who were using cleaned up at that and were able to leave as scheduled. There was a handful who had to remain and go through some detox. And when they came back, they were followed for 3 years by a psychologist at Washington University in St. Louis. And her findings were incredible. First, she found that the majority of people who did have drug problems in Vietnam had drug problems before they went to Vietnam. And in terms of the folks who came back, only 12% resumed drug use, and that was 12% over a 3-year period. And it makes perfect sense, right? It's not around. If you want to use it, you have to go to Harlem, you have to go to South Bronx, pretty dangerous neighborhoods. And whereas before you just went out of your hooch and, there it was. So you'd have to interact with threatening, put yourself in very scary situations. It was illegal. It effectively wasn't illegal in Vietnam. And the reasons to use it were kind of gone. You were home with your family, you had things to do, people expected things of you. And so, they were able to leave it behind. And that shows again that, you can show me a brain scan. I'll admire the science and the technology, But I'll say, what are the implications of this? What if that was the brain scan of a guy in Vietnam? It didn't mean that he didn't have the capacity to control himself. He was told he wasn't getting on the plane and he stopped. So I am very critical and skeptical of the way we've scientized this problem. I should be very clear. Look, I'm a psychiatrist. Some of my best friends are brilliant neuroscientists. I really admire their work tremendously, but it's come out on the other end, not from the brilliant neuroscientists, but from the rhetoricians of this debate and this issue, is that it's a brain problem, and you basically, and in fact, the head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse says it takes your free will away. It looks like that. I grant you, when you're in the middle of using, but we know that that doesn't need to be the case.
And I think this is a great segue, because one of the things that I've really found, and I spent a year in Youngstown, Ohio, for a documentary that I'm making for PBS, and I really saw the human problem. And one of the quotes that I love from the existential psychologist Rollo May, and I think it dovetails nicely with what you're saying, is that we are neither as free as we hope nor as bound as we fear. And I think that we can't fetishize the science so that we become mechanical and then overlook these deep human problems. And I think that's something that you talked about in your paper, and I've seen firsthand, is that in Vietnam, there's boredom, there's terror, they're disconnected from all of the sources of meaning that you would find. And then they get back home, they're connected with family, with friends, with work, with stability, with the arts and culture. And how much is that, even just anecdotally? I mean, even people, because you're in the room working with people, trying to help them, and how much of it is really these basic human institutions of human meaning that have been degraded in predominantly poor American communities?
I think, well, I'll just talk more generically. I think that people use drugs for reasons. And I think that, in fact, that's when I give this lecture and say, if it's a disease, what kind of disease is it? We just talked about one of four, meaning it responds to thoughts and contingencies. And the second is people use drugs for reasons. How is that like any other conventional condition? And for example, if I said to somebody with cancer, with breast cancer, for example, why do you have cancer? I mean, if she's a biologist and a physiologist, she could show me some slides and talk about hormonal influences and chromosomal damage and this kind of thing, and that's interesting, and that's vitally important for treating a classic medical condition. But if I said, but I wouldn't get an answer that took the form of an existential response. But if I ask that, and I do ask that all the time, that's what you do when you work with people with drug problems. Why are you using? And then the answers get to everything from, if a person is in a situation that their circumstances seem hopeless, that's what they'll talk about. If they're a person with everything that would appear to be, everything to lose, look at all these folks in Hollywood. They're gorgeous, they're successful, and yet they struggle mightily with these problems. You don't hear about it so much. They have a lot of cushions, of course, but their problem isn't, I see no hope. Well, maybe they do, but that doesn't come from not having literal opportunities. They just, for whatever reason, they're just in some kind of mental pain. When you read memoirs and addiction memoirs, and remember, of course, they're written by the most eloquent addicts you can find. But one of the most constant themes is self-loathing. Where that comes from, childhood dynamics, that's a big black box. But the point is, you're medicating something. I do believe that.
So in a way, the addiction is not the disease so much as it's the, misguided, often self-defeating attempt at treatment. In a way, would you? I mean, in that metaphor, yeah. There's a deeper root to the disease than just, people are addicts because X, Y, and Z. I think
because they used a drug and then they got hooked.
Yeah.
And they couldn't stop. It looks that way. It could look that way on the outside, But you're right. It's much more of a dynamic.
So walk me through what it takes in your clinical experience working with people. Walk me through a typical process. What does it take to get someone on the road to recovery for an opioid addiction?
Well, if you have an opioid addiction, this may sound bizarre, but in some way you're almost luckier than if you have a methamphetamine or a stimulant addiction because we don't have any medications for a stimulant. And we have excellent medications. So I don't believe everyone needs to be on it, but if a person is really heavily addicted, it probably is smart for them to at least start on them. And there's lots of individual variation how long they'd be on them. But in any case, sometimes it would require a deep detox if they don't want to continue on medications, or if they want to continue on a certain medication, which it's called Vivitrol or naltrexone. Anyway, blocks craving, and then you're on that medication. And then there's another class, two other classes really, and just to throw a little jargon, there's methadone, which I'm sure everyone's heard of. That's considered a full agonist, meaning it completely replaces opioids on the receptors. It is attaching to opioid receptors, which means if you take too much of methadone, you can overdose. And then there's buprenorphine, Suboxone, which is very popular now, and that's called a partial agonist. It's less dangerous in overdose, which is why it's Schedule 3 in the DEA and not Schedule 2, which is what methadone and most narcotics are. So yeah, you start with let's say you start with medications. Everyone calls them MAT, medication-assisted therapy. And because the first thing you have to do is stabilize someone. The first thing you have to do is just at least break the cycle. They have to stand still if they're going to ever get better. And the medications are very good at that. Now, the question is all the people who, frankly, don't want to be in therapy. I mean, we hear the other side, and the other side is very legitimate, which is to say people who do want to be in therapy or do want these medications, and they live in areas where they aren't available. That's a tragedy in and of itself. But there's this other dimension, which is people are highly ambivalent about getting into treatment for the reasons we talked about. If it's medicating your anguish, why would you want to give that up? And then they have very bad retention rates. So between 40 and 60% of people drop out in the first 6 months. And I think that also reflects the ambivalence that people have. But in any case, you start with that, but then you have to do it's called cognitive behavioral therapy, relapse prevention therapy, and it's very, very helpful. It basically helps people be somewhat self-observing in terms of what kinds of situations, external and internal, like even what kind of feeling states set you up for craving, really wanting to use. And some of it is more conditioned craving. So in other words, it's like the classic try it as people, places, and things. You don't hang around with people you used with, because not only will they offer you drugs, you will have just the way frankly, a dog. I mean, we're all organisms. The way a dog would respond to the bell and the food, and he pairs those things, that happens with humans too, all the time in ways, and we should be more. That affects our whole lives in many ways. But and there's a lot written now in behavioral economics and others about those sort of subconscious, unconscious influences. But in any case, you don't get your boss if you're working. Don't get paid. Don't get paid. Get it direct deposited. These little things. When you walk home from work or walk down the street, just avoid your dealer's house. Go a new route. Get into all these habits of putting things between you and the drug. And it sounds easy, but you can imagine it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work identifying those stressors. You're not going to be able to predict all of them. So one day, one's going to come out of the blue and, sideswipe you. So then how do you deal with it when you do experience that? So there are strategies for that. But then depending on how badly you've burned your bridges, it's a lot of reconstruction. And some of it is, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's easily described. Like you might want to work on, if you're a woman, getting your children back, or if your boss, if fired you but said no, left the door a little bit. Well, you've got to do a lot of work on getting him to trust you again, getting your family to trust you again. All this stuff, takes a lot of work. And if you're really in a bad situation, how do you get housing, and how do you find a social network, and all this kind of thing. If it's more internal, then you probably need more sort of psychological work, how to cope better, how to, I hate to use this word, it's such a shorthand, but I'll just say those demons, how to deal with that. However, in some way, that's not something you do right off the bat. You don't get into a therapy that's called highly exploratory therapy. You would never be in analysis. You would never be in a real therapy. I'm sure you can find some experts who would disagree with me, but in general, it's a very bad idea to provoke anxiety in people who are fragile. And that's what these kind of therapies do. This is not the time to talk about your child abuse. It's not. That's a luxury you'll have when you're better. But all these things, the medications and the cognitive behavioral therapy are there to just make sure you don't use drugs. And then a lot of other stuff does start to fall in place. And everyone's different. Some people, all they needed was that stabilization, and they had enough social capital already to say, okay, I think I'm okay now. You broke the cycle, and I can probably, and then someone else has had a lifestyle of this for years, and there's so much fallout that they have to repair and really figure out how to kind of live a life that's different, and that's a lot of work.
And for the last question, I want to get your take, and you touched on it a little bit in your paper, which I'd encourage everyone to read. You touched on harm reduction, safe injection sites. That's a huge debate that's raging in Seattle right now. And I'll give you my take very briefly, and I'd love for you agree or disagree to share yours. But my sense is that harm reduction could work if it's on a national scale. But if you have safe injection sites that are only in one locale, you're creating a magnet effect incentive. I know there was a longitudinal study in Vancouver that showed that the number of essentially drug migrants increased from 20% to 52% of the local population around the Insight Clinic. Just my experience visiting doesn't seem to be working very well, doesn't actually help get people on the path out of addiction. And why kind of trying to figure out why, as we're debating it in Seattle, is that I wonder if it's a teleological question or a question of desire, that if you ideologically don't believe in treatment, recovery, getting people off the streets, but you actually do really believe in the kind of stabilizing or permissive drug use as a morally and socially kind of interchangeable lifestyle. My fear is that you try something that might work if it's implemented well, but if it's implemented poorly with the wrong intentions, could be a disaster for a local neighborhood or city.
Yeah.
What is your take? Yeah.
It is complicated. I mean, there's a part of me that would like to see, let some cities start it and let it be studied in a really, careful, prospective way by independent researchers. And then it would be probably run more carefully. But when I read about the gentleman in your paper, I have to admit, those are not the kind of people I run across that much in terms of the advocates and the people who at least are vocal about it. And some of them might be cynical, and some of them I think are truthful. They say this is an avenue into getting help. But what you describe is basically a person who wants to make addicted people a protected class.
Yeah.
I'd say, is that what you want for first? Is that what you want for your kid? I mean, this is the bigotry of low expectations. I mean, it's just, I mean, we might have to settle for these things, but if this is your goal, it's so paternalistic in a pernicious way, I think. So I don't like, that's what I talked about in the paper. I mentioned what I call aspirational harm reduction versus maintenance harm reduction.
Yes.
Like substances will just keep you alive. And I grant you it's not a trivial goal, but why do we have to stop there? Maybe we won't be able to succeed with everyone, but that shouldn't be our expectation. So I'm more concerned about the particular ideology of what its goal is. I mean, if it's just to maintain people as a last resort because nothing else works, I can see that. But if this is kind of the incoming, if that's all there is, so to speak, then I think that's just I think it's a dereliction of duty to people you supposedly care about. Why wouldn't you want to help them thrive, you know? Um, so that's what I have trouble with. I also just have real trouble with people being left to not contribute at all. I'm not even to pay taxes, but you just have to contribute. And you know, everyone knows how to do something. I mean, I see them in the methadone clinic all the time, and a lot of these people haven't graduated, well, maybe they've graduated high school, and maybe they haven't, but they all have a skill. They all do something, and I mean, maybe I sound like Pollyanna, but if we have to have these kinds of um, facilities, I'd like to see people helping maintain them, like they're part of that community. So the women cook, or men, if they like that, and they paint and they repair and they do maintenance. These folks know how to do this stuff. Not everyone, of course, and they all have a different strengths, and they should be doing it. And guess what? They want to do. Most people want to be busy. They want to be needed. They want to feel effective. And you get a taste of that, and you often want to go further.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and goes to solve some of those human problems of purposelessness, not participating, not having relationships that I've seen in my work. And I know some of the more innovative services that are actually targeting homeless, often addicts in many cases. Having people work, giving people a sense of putting their skills to use, no matter what state they're in, is actually part of the solution. And
it's definitely, and it's therapeutic as heck. Yeah.
Yeah, it's therapeutic. So